السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. حياكم الله في
Peace be upon you and welcome to this conference. We have three speakers today. Mrs. Bahia and Dr. Kaddorah and Dr. Emad Qaddorah. We will start with Mrs. Bahia. She is doctoral candidate in history at Sultan Qaboos University. She lectured in the Department of History at the same university from 2014 to 2017. She received a Cambridge diploma for teaching and training from the university. She published the political and cultural history of Al-Qabil region from 856, published by Omani Society of Writers, and she will talk about the Indo-Omani military relations from 1913 to 1970. The floor is hers. In the name of God, peace upon you. So I will talk about Indo-Omani military relations between 1913 and 1970. It's a documentary study based on British documents and some Omani documents issued by Sultan Timur bin Faisal. First of all, the study is of three parts. First of all, an geographical and historical overview of Oman and India. Then the military presence of India in Oman. We all know that Oman is in the south of the Arab Peninsula, eastern part, and there were economical and trade relations between Oman and India, and there were military also relations with the presence of British. For the second part, the Indian military presence from 1913 to 1970. There are also some Indians, military Indians, who worked in the Omani army, but in a very small proportion. When we speak about military presence, we speak about Indian British military. Why this period? There are many reasons for that. The most important one is that this area is the presence of the imama or the imamship, and there was the sultanate on the coast, and the imama tried to dominate the areas, and they took the control of Sama'il between important parts of Oman, and the forces attacked the towns of Barka and two other villages, and they tried to go to reach Muscat, and here started the British intervention to stop this invasion. For the presence of the Indian presence, it was through sending few groups of military or battalions which supported the Sultan in Matrah, and there were 5 British officers and 6 Indian officers, in addition to 31 others, and 256, and they had a presence to protect this area from the attack of the imama. and another colonel was sent along with 100 soldiers, Indian soldiers, and 6 also groups were sent. The Indian elements in the plan of the British, so it was to protect Muscat and to guarantee that there is a strong unit which is able to protect Muscat from the attacks of the Imama. The first plan started in 1916 with the aim of having a force of 300 troops, British and Indian. Then there was another plan under the control of Robert Payne, a force made or composed of the Brahmins, Indian, and many details are about the salaries or the payments of these soldiers and many other military details and activities, military activities. In 1917, there were another plan for the commander Berkeley Haworth, which was reorganizing the force which was present there, and the Sultan Timur had established a plan which failed. So the British government played a role in bringing this force to 200 or 300 troops, including Indian military. And in 1920, Ronald Ringett put together a plan where they enrolled Baluch, people from Baluchistan. For the Indian commanders and officers in the Muscat unit or Muscat force after 1921, there were a group of commanders and officers who took over. We could mention Fatah Khan, who was a lieutenant, and he became the commander of the force. There are other leaders or commanders, as you see, and some of them had military grades, positions, and others administrative. And among the Indian elements who were commanders of this force, as we said, Fatah Khan, then Muhammad Ismail, lieutenant. There is Meher Khan, Hazar Hussein, Jihandat Khan. All these took the control or were commanders of that force, and they also ensured many other positions, administrative positions. During the Second World War, British officers came to assist, and it continued until 1947, the year where Pakistan separated from India. There are others support units for services like medical services and others. and there were a number of medical officers in the infantry of Muscat and other forces which were formed later on. We could mention among them Taqi Khan in 1925, another doctor, physician, Mufti Qureshi, he was a commander. Sifi Fasi, who was a dentist in the medical services unit in 1960. The third part of this study is the reciprocal influence or impact between India and Oman. And when I talk about that, I mention the military terms used and also the uniforms, which started with Indians, and it influenced the Omani officers, and they were adopted until 1970. Among the military terms, the Beit Kashmir term, which is about internal unit of the military forces of the Sultan in Suhar, precisely. This unit, the site was called Beit Kashmir. Mr. Hamad bin Faisal Al Said inhabited in that building, and it was chosen for this unit. We have also the term Subidar, which is linked to military grade, which is a lieutenant. There is also Dubi or Duhubi for non-fighting units. There is also Sabahi, which means soldier. Khaki or Kaki, which means or refers to the color of the uniform, and which means dust. This uniform, because it is similar, close to the color of the land, so there is like camouflage. For the other influence or in the military, so it is the uniform of the military units. It is called khaki or khaki, and also shorts, and also the red sockets, the red socks. There is also breha, which is the hat, which is red, and also black shoes open from front. In 1970, the guard unit was in charge of protecting positions and sites in Oman. They have the same uniform which was used by Indian militaries. And this is now the description of that uniform you are seeing in the photo. This document is sent from the Sultan Said bin Taimur, where he mentioned certain officers who were recruited, and he used the word Jamadar. This photo also reflects some of the influence of Indian uniforms on Omani uniforms. This photo was in 1960, And the influence of Indian uniforms is visible on military troops. In addition to other uniforms. This document includes the regulations for recruiting militaries, and Sultan Timur was mentioning the uniform and the description of the uniform that they should be having. It also referred to some of the military grades, like Shawish, Badge Shawish. In conclusion, the presence of Indians in Oman during this period, 1930-1970, was linked to the presence of the British, and there were trade agreements and the category which was relied upon is characterized by physical features which are necessary for fighting. There was the battle of Bit al-Falj, and after that it started relying less on Indian troops and reinforcing the presence of Omani recruitees in the military. We notice also that there were influence which remained even after the departure of Indians. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for our speaker. Now we move to the following speaker, Dr. Kadira Pethiyagoda, researcher, the Department of Asian and Middle East Relations in Brookings Center here in Doha. It is also from Lakshman Kadira Institute of International Relations and Strategic Research in Sri Lanka. He's focusing on the relations between India and Gulf countries. He's gonna talk about relations between India and Arab countries and its strategic development. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, for much of history, modern history, India-Middle East relations centered almost exclusively on economic ties. Political relations were constrained by ideology, the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, and resource constraints. The economic focus was understandable, given that the Middle East has been key to India's prosperity, which has been an overriding policy objective for both BJP and Congress governments. The economies of India and the Middle East enjoy structural complementarity. Economic engagement totaled around $186 billion US in 2013-14, making it India's largest trading partner. Trade alone with the GCC stood at $91 billion in 2016. The Economist Intelligence Unit found that India and China were becoming amongst the most critical trade and investment partners for the GCC. And while Middle Eastern countries sell their excess oil and gas, India sells its excess labor, with around 9 million Indians working in the region. In 2016, remittances from the GCC were around $34.9 billion. India leads the world as a recipient of foreign remittances, and these form a key part of the economy, particularly amongst poorer households. But in the last decade or so, several factors have emerged which have raised the strategic stakes for India. I'll talk about 4 of these factors, as well as the advantages and constraints that India faces in terms of responding. Firstly, existing pillars in the relationship have taken, like energy trade, have taken on a greater strategic significance. There's a growing expectation amongst policymakers and the public that India will become a global military power. Indian policymakers have long evinced a belief that India deserved more recognition internationally, but the method of gaining that recognition has evolved. Earlier, it was via projecting the image of a moral leader of the third world. But now, India adopts a more common approach amongst countries, which is the expansion of strategic and economic power. This worldview has impacted numerous policy areas, including nuclear posture. This gives India's already growing dependence on Middle Eastern energy a more strategic dimension. Oil is particularly important for military power projection due to the lack of alternatives for vehicles and aircraft. Demand is expected to grow faster than supply. Already, of all the major external powers involved in the Middle East, India is arguably the most dependent on energy from the region relative to total consumption. The increasing strategic importance of energy imports is seen in India's actions. During Prime Minister Modi's visit to Saudi Arabia, the countries agreed to transform the buyer-seller relationship into a strategic partnership. The joint statement from the visit explicitly linked expanding trade ties to enhance strategic engagement. Even India's efforts to become energy independent have included foreign acquisitions of upstream hydrocarbon reserves, which may require military protection in an unstable region. India's security aspirations in its extended region are also growing. Of all the great powers and rising powers, India is the closest geographically to the Middle East. There's an increased expectation amongst the Indian public of their country being one of the most powerful in the Indian Ocean, and the Middle East is key to this. A poll found that not only did 94% of Indians feel their country should have the most powerful navy in the Indian Ocean, but 89% believe that India should do more to lead cooperation in the region. India's growing international trade increases the importance of protecting sea lanes. Back since 2000, both Congress and BJP administrations have stated that the Middle East is strategically interrelated to South Asia. According to one of Delhi's maritime doctrines, the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea are vital to India's strategic interests, including securing choke points. Thirdly, there are concerns over the instability in the region and increasing tensions which threaten India's energy imports and diaspora. India fears that the great powers currently involved in the Middle East are unable or unwilling to ensure stability. Delhi's past inability to influence geopolitics in the Middle East, combined with a lack of security presence, have meant costly evacuations of its diaspora, around 25,000 in recent upheavals, including 5,000 in 2015 from the war in Yemen, the largest one in history during the Gulf War with 200,000 people from Kuwait. And of course, this diaspora is important to Delhi, both economically as well as increasingly politically important as well. This instability in the region is, of course, furthered by shifting power balances and potential arms race between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Perhaps the most important factor, though, is the increasing multipolarity in the Middle East and the relative decline of US influence and interest. Under President Obama, Washington tried to some degree to pivot away from the Middle East. And while President Trump has made some conflicting statements about staying in Syria, his overarching instinct seems to be less interventionist, noting, of course, his trademark unpredictability. And while the US will stay involved to some degree, there's a growing aversion amongst the American public towards foreign interventions. Additionally, Russia has reasserted itself through intervening in Syria and maintaining a supporting port in the Eastern Mediterranean. But more relevant to India is that China is translating its economic relationship into a strategic one. Beijing sees the region as a continuation of the trade routes it seeks to secure from East Asia through to Africa and Europe. China is the largest foreign business stakeholder in the Middle East, surpassing the US in oil purchases. Its trade with the Middle East and North Africa increased more than 600% in the decade up to 2014, reaching 230 billion. Beijing has positioned itself as a less judgmental alternative to America. It signed security agreements with American allies like Saudi Arabia, as well as backing adversaries to the United States like Iran and supporting Russia on the issue of Syria. All this will drive Delhi to increase its own influence and avoid China having leverage over India's energy security, as well as avoid being encircled by Chinese allies. And there's, of course, existing factors that will continue to have an impact. Competition with Pakistan, for example, drives India's efforts to strengthen its relations with Middle Eastern countries to weaken Islamabad's support base. The region has traditionally been Pakistan's ally and a source of financial and diplomatic support. GCC states had in the past supported Islamabad on Kashmir, but more recently they've taken more regard of Indian sensitivities. So in terms of responding to these factors, over the last 2 years, we've seen a massive uptick in activity by the Modi government. His Link West policy has evolved into Think West and has sprung into action. There's been head of state visits between India, Iran, and the Gulf states and Israel. The joint statements from the visits have all highlighted strategic ties encompassing defense, maritime security, and anti-terrorism efforts. In recent years, Delhi signed security and defense agreements with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, and Qatar. There's been greater defense and naval cooperation like joint exercises. And an Indian foreign secretary stated, with regard to the Gulf, that we are no longer content to be passive recipients of outcomes. India has certain advantages that Modi can utilize. Firstly, India has significant soft power and a positive image in the region. This is a result of culture, shared history, and a record of neutrality and non-interference. India also has the unique advantage of having a massive diaspora, which constitutes pluralities in several Gulf states. Additionally, similar to small countries globally, Middle Eastern states are seeking to diversify their great power partnerships. So while they've thus far relied on the US, they're increasingly feeling they need to place their eggs in multiple baskets, even with Trump's closer ties to Saudi Arabia. India does, however, face certain constraints. Internally, there are challenges in terms of strategic planning, policy development, implementation, despite the vision of leaders. At the bureaucratic level, the IFS and the Ministry of External Affairs have rapidly expanding priorities. Modi has, however, stated that he seeks to move away from a reactive foreign policy into one that proactively shapes outcomes. GCC states, however, knowing India's internal limitations, may be wary of investing too much in the strategic relationship at the potential cost of relations with other countries like China. Ideology and domestic politics may also impinge on an interest-based strategic focus. There's also external constraints. Historically, India's had the unique ability to play multiple sides and to be friends with everyone. But as it gets more involved, this will become increasingly difficult. There's also competition with external powers like China and Pakistan, which act as both a motivator and a constraint. The limited diplomatic resources available to many Middle Eastern states may make it difficult for them to rapidly progress ties with multiple partners at the same time. So looking to the future, for India, conceptualizing the Middle East purely on economic terms will no longer suffice. The actions and rhetoric of the Modi government suggest that they understand this. Discussions with Indian policymakers suggest that the bureaucracy now sees the Middle East as part of a broader geopolitical strategy. But to secure its long-term interests, India will need to expend resources in the short term to support regional stability. India will likely seek to maintain its image of strategic autonomy, amidst the growing tensions between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. Interestingly, Trump's approach to the world seems to be to push global politics in this kind of direction with no permanent friends or enemies. Strategic autonomy allows India to exert influence across a broader range of countries than if they were to ally with a certain side. This may, however, need to be complemented with more significant strategic military engagement. As always in Indian foreign policy, interests will be balanced with values like pluralism and tolerance of different regime types, as well as with domestic public opinion. India's increasing strategic focus on the Gulf may not always lead to Delhi pursuing policies that support the interests of GCC states, though Trump's dumping of the Iran nuclear deal will potentially increase trade between India and the Gulf states. In terms of some suggested recommendations, given Delhi is being courted by numerous powers and the Ministry of External Affairs is stretched, Middle Eastern policymakers will need to harness and highlight the aforementioned emerging factors. Areas of overlapping interest should be emphasized, including maintaining internal stability and smooth energy flows. Middle Eastern states should facilitate or suggest regular strategic dialogues with security elites, as well as the elevation of current defense exchanges to a higher level. The joint statements made after Modi's visit could be used as roadmaps. They could support and advocate India's proposals at the UN, like the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. And finally, Gulf governments could also seek to improve their image through better working conditions for India's diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadira. And now, Professor Emad Kaddorah. He has 4 publications: An Ambitious Strategy and Constrained Policy, a Geopolitical Approach, and he has the floor. ميكروفون لو سمحت. ميكروفون. أيوة لا. No. I would like to thank the Arab Center and the organizers of this event about the relations between the Arab world and India. In reality, my paper will focus on the strategic dimensions, not in detail, in the political level and also in the possible outcomes of these relations, and also the impact of China. The major element in these relations is the United States. First of all, the Gulf area has always been characterized by the fact that it is on the edges of Eurasia and near the ocean, and the containment policy, the traditional containment policy, it will have an impact in the renewal of the Indian Ocean. So it has an important geological or geographical position, economically, and the Gulf area is an important part of the strategy of India, and it is called the string of pearls. They see that China is trying to dominate it, and the Gulf area is in the heart of the development of this strategy at present and in the future. Therefore, the two Indian and Chinese parts are trying to have a better position, and everyone will try to contain the other, either through wisdom or by realism, which is the conflict of interests. And this paper discusses the geopolitical importance for the GCC countries in the strategy of India. I will focus on China. There is Pakistan and Iran also, but I will focus on China and the balance between India and China, and the role played by the GCC countries in all this. As for the geopolitical importance is geographical, which is a permanent one, and the change of the importance. There are many factors like globalization, and this allowed to overcome the geographical position, but it remains of some importance, and it's an important element in international politics. Geopolitical is about having influence in various parts of the world and being able to reach these areas. So the Gulf area is placed near the Eurasian. Harport Mackinder said in 1919, and he said that it is the center of Earth, and he mentioned many parts of it, from the river of Inland until the Danube river in Europe. And he mentioned many of these parts, including Iran, and he says that whoever dominates this area will dominate the world. He didn't mention the Gulf because he mentioned it within the competition between Europe and Russia. In order to reach the warm waters and to reinforce the position of Britain in India and in the Middle East. Spikeman in 1942 mentioned the area which is surrounds, which he called the heartland, and he said that whoever dominates the rimland will dominate that area, internal area, and therefore will dominate the world. So this containment concept came in 1947 when he sent a long telegram to the United States when he was working in Moscow, and asked the United States to contain the force in Eurasia. This will be useful later on when we talk about our subject. The economical importance of the GCC countries, we remind you of certain points. Although the Gulf area is relatively small and with a small population relatively also, in comparison with China or big countries in the world, it acquired a strategic position. It represents the most dynamic part in the Middle East. The GCC countries play financial roles and a political role, and we can notice that Indian and Chinese relations are essential with the Gulf countries, not other countries like Egypt, Iraq, or Syria. The Gulf countries witnessed development of their economic power. The oil reserves in 2017 reached 1,023 billion barrels. In 1950, the estimation was of 50 billion barrels. And after 70 years of production, intensive production, the oil reserves has multiplied many times. The oil prices increased from 20 to 160 in 2013, which allowed the Gulf countries to have a lot of money, like the sovereign funds now have huge amounts, and also the investments, external investments reached $6,000 billion. The role of Gulf countries in the economic strong points and the sovereign funds are playing a big role in helping on or supporting Western economies. The choice for Gulf countries is to go to the new power houses like China and India. And the Gulf countries are or are convinced that they should diversify their partnerships, and Asia is expected to be a powerhouse as the economic weight will go towards Asia. This map represents this shift in 1980, and until 2049 it will reach China and India. In 1980, it is the GDP of those countries. It was in the Atlantic between the United States and Europe, and the increase in the production of China and India, and now it's moving to the east. This shift will reflect on international relations, and most countries will try to have good relations with Asia. In conclusion, the Gulf countries are interested in reinforcing its relations with India and China. The strategic objectives of India is to protect its security internally and externally and have a strong economy. And the Indian strategy is composed of 3 parts or 3 fields. The first circle is the close neighbors in the Southeast Asia, and India will try to dominate this area and prevent foreign forces to play a big role. And the second circle is the neighbors in Asia and the Indian Ocean coasts for balanced relationship to be able to control and influence the balance of powers in this area. And the third circle is the international arena, where India would like to have a position as one of the main powers in the world, and trying to have a permanent position in the Security Council. India owns 12 main seaports, dealing with 90% of its trade. The position of the Gulf area in this strategy, according to Manmohan Singh, in 2010, he said that the Gulf area is part of our natural economic area. And just one thing said, when we talk about Indonesia or Central Asia or Gulf area, we are talking about the main positions of our economy in Asia. Based on his experience in Gujarat also, priority were given to reorganize the foreign policy of India based on diplomacy, active diplomacy, and to promote the trademark of India. The maritime routes are very important, like Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and the relations with the Gulf countries represent special importance, and they represent also one of the main commercial partners in the world. And India will rely on oil and gas, will reach 92% from all over the world. 600 billion of investments of the Gulf countries, and India will try to have part of this investment. I don't want to repeat what has been said for Saudi Arabia. The announcement of Oman, of Saudi Arabia reflects this new trend of enforcing or strengthening the trade. Qatar is the main provider of LNG, and there was a defense agreement the Emirates are the country who has the best relations, economic relations with India. There are strategic challenges, and India and China both have raising emerging economies, and they are trying to reach the markets and to have maritime positions, and they are competing to strengthen their position. But India is the only emerging force which were keen to have a balanced relationship with China. The Minister of Defense of India said that these countries, without mentioning China, they want to have maritime positions in the area and having bases, building seaports and infrastructure. China worked during the recent years at establishing bases in the north of the Indian Ocean, including Pakistan through the airport of Qaboos, and in Sri Lanka also through the port of Hambantota for 99 years, Myanmar and Maldives, which received investments from China. The provision line are in the west of Indian Ocean in Djibouti. Where there was the first military base abroad, as well as with Oman and other countries. There are other bases also in the south, in Seychelles and Madagascar. From another part, India is implementing the same approach and the same strategy, trying to have permanent bases with Oman, and there is an Indian company to build the Shahbar seaport in 350 kilometers only from Qatar. It has an agreement with Seychelles to build an airport and cooperation with Seychelles and Madagascar. So both countries are to reinforce their positions in the Indian. The purpose is not to dominate, but every one of the two countries try to safeguard its security. The advantage for India is the presence of manpower in the Gulf countries. For France, India used the island of Réunion near Madagascar. So the importance of India is present in the national security in the U.S. It appears 8 times in a very positive way. As China, it is always mentioned negatively or almost negatively. So we mention 2 expressions. For India, we welcome the rise of India as a world power, and we would like to promote our relations with them. This strategy mentions China as China and Russia as revisionist regimes, and China extended its strength on the expense of other countries. In conclusion, about the balance of India and China, it is not expected that the US will go back to have alliances in order to counter the influence of China through the alliance between the US and the Gulf countries, the strategic alliance with India. Here, India has many options, three ones. Not trusting anybody, because China and the US are working in order to achieve their interests. So India would like to rely on itself, or it might cooperate with the United States to counter the Chinese influence. How can China overcome the favorable aspects or the elements in favor of India by reactivating the Silk Road? So it tries to encircle the maritime routes through this initiative, and this is so these are initiatives or projects, or some of them are under implementation, and there is more than route which goes through the Gulf, which the Silk Road, which goes from China to Europe. So the containment policy is to prevent any power to dominate. The Gulf will continue to be a very important location and area. India and China were underdeveloped countries 40 years ago. So geographical of the Gulf area will remain in the strategy of India, not only for oil, because it is the way for the United States to the strategic points everywhere. Thank you, Mr. Emad.
I'd like to thank Mr. Emad. We open now the floor for questions. So I'd like for those who want to ask questions to introduce themselves, and because we don't have enough time, please address your question straight away to the speaker, because we do have only 30 minutes. Yes, please.
I have one question each to the three presenters. First question to Dr. Bahia. Why, in your opinion, the kind of India-Oman military relations that are there could not be developed with other countries of the region? Next, my question is to Dr. Kadira. You mentioned about the structural compatibility between India and Gulf economies. Can you explain this? Next question to Dr. Emad. regarding India's and China's contentment of each other, can you envisage any kind of cooperation between the two powers? Because as we have seen in Sudan, Indian and Chinese companies combining together, cooperating together to a successful venture, and of course in which the Western companies had to leave. So can you envisage such a situation in other Arab countries? Thanks.
شكرا جزيلا. Okay, نبدأ.
Much for your question. Yes, please. I'd like to thank all three speakers. I have one question to my colleague Emad Qaddorah. You spoke about the competition between China and India around the Gulf region, and we can name two competitors, Europe and USA. You also spoke about what China and India are both doing, but on the other hand, we didn't hear about GCC countries, whether as a whole or individually. What are they doing? They are going east. They are trying to diversify their relations. Can we say that this new orientation is affecting Qatar's strategy or the strategy of other neighboring countries? I mean, the economic strategy. Can we see anything tangible? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is to Dr. Kadira. What do you think when you say that Pakistan has been a factor in India's strengthening relation or having relation with the Gulf states? I'm asking this because do you say this in the context of socio-cultural heritage, energy business, investment, or human resource cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My question is to Dr. Kadira. It is a well-known fact that the economics the financial situation of the Indian economy is today is different and better than in the past. So, is Indian government ready to host return migrants from GCC countries and provide them jobs if there will be a conflict, severe conflict between Iran and GCC countries? Thank you so much.
طيب الآن يعني أخذنا طبعا حزمة.
We took a number of questions, and I think we have like 2 to 3 minutes for every speaker to respond to the questions addressed to him or to respond to the questions he feels that he was meant by those questions. So we start with Mr. Emad Kaddorah. For sure, the relation between China and India is not always rivalry or competition, and up to now there is no direct rivalry. There is a hidden struggle for every country's interest. That's why every country is trying to establish front bases, whether naval or whatsoever, to secure their own interest. But China and India have a traditional wisdom and very great and leading empires in the region, and historically, and they are leading in the art of war and also in the art of politics. That's why we won't see any direct conflict, such the conflict we had between the USA and the Soviet Union. in the last century, there will be a lot of areas of cooperation between India and China. Also, the same applies to many other areas and sectors of competition. But the relation between China and India is governed by securing natural resources. If they can get to that point through agreement, that's always the best. But there's always a kind of concern if this fails. The second question, what are GCC countries doing towards China and India? Well, GCC countries I think Qatar and UAE have very advanced ties with India. Qatar signed an agreement with India 2016 to supply India with its needs in petrol, and also Qatar will remain the main provider for the third economy in the world. On the other hand, there was an agreement in 2014, which is a defense agreement to develop some military industries, but as it is the case for most Arab countries, they are not taking the initiative when it comes to relations with India. Regarding UAE, in Modi's visit in 2015, there was a turning point, and there is an aspiration to reach $75 billion of investments in India. The investments of India in UAE, the number which I have here is $55 billion, whether it's through the expats or from other Indian entities. There was an agreement recently. So both countries are very active when it comes to Arab-Indian relations. Thank you so much, Mr. Emad. We give the floor to Dr. Kadira.
So with regard to the first question about the complementarity of economies, what I mainly meant was that India is energy thirsty and has an excess of labor, has a young population, a huge population, provides a lot of services, whereas the Gulf states are hungry for workers but have excess energy reserves. So two of the most important needs of each other's economies they can serve to fulfill. In terms of the Pakistan factor as a motivator for India's engagement with the Gulf, I meant mainly diplomatically. So in terms of, I guess, India's efforts in isolating Pakistan internationally on issues like Kashmir, I think that's part of the reason why India seeks to target the Gulf states who have been traditional supporters of Pakistan and also economic supporters of Pakistan. In terms of can India host returned migrants in the event of a major conflict between Iran and Saudi, I think India is obviously a huge country, but I think one of the issues is that a lot of those migrants to the Gulf come from a handful of states. So, for example, the state of Kerala has a high proportion of its population in the Middle East. So that would have a major impact on their economy if all those workers were to return. So I would say that India, it would be very difficult, and that India has a direct interest, therefore, in seeking to prevent such a major conflict occurring in the region. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadira. I give now the floor to Mrs. Bahia. Regarding the question of Mr. Muhammad Azhar, why we don't see development of the military relations? Well, I can say that there is always a competition within Oman, the Imama forces and the Sultanate forces. Therefore, there were many agreements between the Sultan and the British government due to the Indian-British presence there. That's why many. There was another agreement between India and Oman in 1953, and that led to establishing an Indian consulate in 1956. Some GCC countries, I said earlier, one of the officials of India, Niaz Ali, was lieutenant in Muscat. This gentleman was promoted and he became the leader of the naval forces in the region, and there was an incident which led to decrease in the presence of India, and this was particularly the case of killing another Indian or an Omani soldier, and this led to reducing the presence of Indian military in Oman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Please.
صوتك مسموع الدكتور يعني.
لا مسموع، احنا مش مسموع. Muhammad Yassin from Syria. The researchers neglected the influence of the Iranian role in the Arab-Indian relations, especially when we know that Iran are also oil and gas production. Maybe Mr. Emad Kaddorah could answer this one. Doctor? Peace be upon you. Dr. Kadira, you talked about relations between India and Gulf countries, and you mentioned that they are strengthening their relations with Arabs and Israelis. And he said there is no permanent friends, but there are permanent interests. If the Arab countries strengthen their relations with Pakistan, they don't appreciate it. So can we say that India can improve their relations with Israel, but the Arabs cannot improve the relations with Pakistan?
Hi. First of all, it was a wonderful presentation by all three speakers. I have a very unconventional question to make here. Do you think that everyone else except India has a strategic plan in the region, considering the fact that since I am also part of the diaspora here, I do remember of times when, I do want to remember the fact that the Indian diaspora's presence here is not because it was part of some strategic expansion. It's because they were, escaping a sort of socio-economic conditions back home. So it sort of looks as though India is put in this situation because of its expanding diaspora, and India is in a situation where it has to take the right, strategic steps. But seems like everyone else except India has a strategic plan in the region.
Can you direct your question to one of
this question is to Kadira or to Kadira. To Dr. And even I'm sure that Dr. Imad will also have something to say about it.
It's just for the sake of time, so that every speaker doesn't have to address.
Sorry, I missed the start of that question. Just the first
No, I said that I said that. Do you think that everyone, except India herself, has a strategic plan in the region?
تفضل.
My question is for Mr. Emad Qaddorah. The relations between Arab Gulf countries and India had known different stages, especially India was a dialogue partner in the GCC. And my question is, how is it possible for India to deal with its relations with Iran and from the GCC? Because 2001-2003 there was cooperation between the two parties. There is also an hypothesis saying that the strength of the Gulf is proportional to the regress of influence of the United States in the area. Thank you very much. So now we start with Dr. Kadira. إذا أردت أن تضيف.
So with regard to the question about can India strengthen its ties with Israel, but why can't Arab countries strengthen their ties with Pakistan? I think, you know, all four of those groups, like all of those countries, will be acting based on their own interests at the particular time. So, and the amount of leverage they have in terms of those particular relationships. So, I think at the moment, a lot of the Gulf Arab states are seeing the importance of strategic ties with India, but of course Pakistan is still a very important security partner for those countries, particularly given you know, that it provides a lot of manpower for their security services. And also, I think, you know, it's interesting, there's no permanent friends or enemies issue when it comes to the rapprochement between, for example, Saudi Arabia and Israel. As well, where they're seeing that Iran is a mutual threat, and potentially with the support of the Trump administration, both those sides are starting to thaw their relations a little bit. So they might actually see that India having relations with Israel is not so much of an issue. But I think one thing that India has been successful at that a lot of other countries have had difficulty with is being friends with a lot of different groups. And I think, you know, compared to certain other countries, like maybe the United States, India isn't as assertive in telling other countries not to be friends with Pakistan. They're more sort of subtle about the way they try and do it. So I think that's also a factor. But at the end of the day, they're all sovereign countries, and they will all act on their own interests at the time. In terms of your question about the Indian diaspora and about whether everyone has a strategy except India. I mean, that's obviously something that Indian scholars and scholars of India have long lamented, that the lack of strategic focus within Indian foreign policy. I think that, I mean, just from what I've read, there seems to be noises coming that Modi is trying to change that to some degree. But I think because of the history of non-alignment and of strategic autonomy, there may be an aversion to sort of outwardly articulating a vision like that involves sort of, you know, strategic or military issues to that degree, and so that might be an issue. But I haven't seen anything sort of solid saying that things have changed on that front. And obviously, you know, it is an important thing that they should look at, given that they have these unique advantages like the diaspora in the region that other countries don't have. So.
شكرا.
Thank you, Dr. Kadira. دكتور عماد تفضل. The two questions concerning Iran. The Iranian role is very important. We can't ignore it in the relations between India and the Arab world. Iran geographically is in between, but it's important that we should not imagine that any external countries like India or the US or China, when they want to have a relationship with the Gulf, it has to be on the expense of another, or they have to take in consideration the sensitivities of every country looks at its interest, as India also looked at its interest. And if they leave the field to China, China will be ready to take over. So every party will take many factors in consideration. Gwadar, Chabar in Iran and Gwadar in Pakistan. And they are very close. And they are not very far from Muscat, only 350 kilometers. This means that every one of these countries know very well, and China invested in Gwadar and established an infrastructure so that it is an exporting center. And India did the same in Iran. But at the same time, China and India are working with Iran and with the Gulf countries. And this is also a reply on the third question about the United States. Is the strength or the power of India on the expense of the US? Nowadays, it's not a power taking over another power. It is a cooperation, but every country knows their interests and acts for their interests. Therefore, the Gulf countries are not the determinant element in the relations with Iran. Thank you, Mr. Emad. I would like to thank all the speakers and the participants. And there is no doubt that it was very interesting. And I give the floor to Dr. Marwan to close this conference, and we hope that there will be other encounters. Thank you. Peace be upon you. Thank you, Sheikh Suhaim. Thank you for presiding this session. As we would like to close by thanking all the researchers who participated with us in this conference, our colleagues coming from India, and also the Arab researchers. And I appreciate really the interest shown by everybody with their valuable papers. Our Indian colleagues enriched the sessions of this conference, and I think that I don't know if Professor Ekibasha, he said that he was studying the relations between the Arab-Indian-Indo relations, and this conference is the first conference which deals with these relations from various aspects, and we appreciate this description. And as I said, the presentations and the papers were very important, and I liked in particular that it had shown many positive points or common points through the colonial era. And Dr. Pant, Dr. Muhammad Azhar drew the attention on the possibility to have a partnership, Arab-Indian partnership in building capabilities and capacities, because India is a rising power in technological competencies, and Dr. Pant talked about an alliance based on those bases. I think that there is room to strengthen our relations in this domain, and I think that these common points are many more than the conflictual points. We all are in the eastern part of this world, and there are also cultural links, because we have this Oriental culture, and we mentioned that in yesterday's one papers when we talked about Mughal. India is the big Islamic country, or with a minority, which the Muslims are even maybe more than the Muslims in Pakistan, which is an Islamic country. And this could be a unifying factor between. So if we want to build relations based on interests, these interests will require that we have higher levels of cooperation. We have seen that Al-Hind is one of the biggest trade partner for Arab countries, and we have seen that through the presentations of today. I hope that the works of this conference will be published in a booklet, and we hope that our participants will use the feedback they have got to probably modify or adapt their researches, and we can publish some of the researches online, digitally. We wanted to start with this conference 9 months ago, and we looked for literature. We didn't find a lot of them, and the Arab researchers interested in India are not many. So we hope that after this conference we'll change this situation, and we will be able to provide literature which is modern, new, and interesting. Again, I would like to thank all the participants and all those who contributed in the success of this conference, and the team of the Arab Center for their efforts in organizing, and we hope that this conference will be the first of a series of other Indo-Arab encounters, not necessarily in Doha, in India, if it is possible, so that we have researchers and we serve the interest of both parts. Thank you.